Lemmy Kilmister wasn't just a rock legend. He was a force of nature with an opinion sharper than his bass guitar. This Motorhead frontman had a unique talent for slicing through the fluff of the music world, often calling out bands he despised with brutal honesty. Curious about who made his cut? Get ready to explore the bands that faced Lemmy's wrath, where rivalries ignited and the spirit of rock and roll reigned supreme. Lemmy's views on music. Lead singer of Motorhead Lemmy had a very strong concept about music. Music need to be authentic, loud, and intensely energetic, he thought. Rock and roll and metal, the kind of music that makes you want to dance and feel alive, where to him the finest forms. When music sounded too perfect or overproduced, meaning it had too many fancy sounds or effects giving it false impression, he disliked it. Lemmy wanted music to be raw and unvarnished, devoid of fancy buttons or techniques meant to make it sound pleasing. Lemmy was of the opinion that rock music ought to be defiant, which means that it ought to be somewhat rule-breaking and accomplished in any manner that one chooses. With relation to this, he found both punk music and classic rock and roll were appealing to him. It was not about attaining perfection. Rather, it was about feeling the music in your bones and being authentic to who you are. Certain bands did not conform to Lemmy's conception of music because they emphasized their outward appearances or the quality of their sound rather than allowing the music to speak for itself. The music that Lemmy considered to be real lacked all of those elements. The only things that were required were a modest modification in attitude, excitement, and integrity. Therefore, Lemmy thought in the kind of music if you ever come across a loud, raw song that stirs strong feelings inside you. The clash with glam metal, Lemmy's take on the 80s rock scene. The rock music scene underwent significant separation in the 1980s. One side had glam metal with its leather leggings, cosmetics, and teased hair. Conversely, you had hard-edged rockers like Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead, who lacked tolerance for the glitter and gloss. Lemmy disliked glam metal, rather than only found it objectionable, and he wasn't quiet in expressing this. The quintessential rock and roll renegade was Lemmy Kilmister, the venerable Motorhead frontperson. Deeply steeped in the rawness of rock music, the grit, and the sincerity it stood for, he loved to him. Glam metal, especially the 1980s bands, was nothing except what rock ought not be. With their overdone attire and polished sound, bands like Poison and Motley Crue reflected what Lemmy hated. He regularly attacked these bands for emphasizing appearance above their music. Lemmy came right out in interviews. Once he said, bluntly discounting glam metal's fixation on image over substance, "All they care about is how their hair looks and they can't even play." To him, rock music was about real expression, raw energy, and rebellion, not about your eyeliner count. Lemmy embodied the tough-and-tumble rock lifestyle in sharp contrast to the glam metal culture. Lemmy was the show, not putting on anything with his scruffy beard, cowboy boots, and always-present leather jacket. Often performing on stage, downing Jack Daniels and chain smoking, he lived and breathed rock music. Just pure rock intensity, not glitter or glamour. This tough image ran quite counter to the polished, showy appearance of glam metal groups. Lemmy was in soiled jeans and a t-shirt while glam rockers walked about in spandex and neon. He was simply interested in playing hard, fast, and loud. He had no idea about fitting into any one mold or trend. Lemmy's annoyance with glam metal went beyond appearances to include what rock music represented. Rock to him was about revolt, nonconformism, and an attitude that questioned the system. With its mass-market appeal and ostentatious clothes, glam metal embodied the very reverse. It was about following a commercialized box, and Lemmy objected. In one very caustic interview, he observed, "These guys are all posing. Although they are doing rock and roll, it is only a performance. Their bones do not reflect it." For Lemmy, glamorous metal lacked authenticity. Real rock, he thought, comes from a place of emotion and lived experience, not from dancing technique or hairstyle perfection. Lemmy versus Guns N' Roses, a tale of two rock and roll icons. The band Guns N' Roses and Lemmy Kilmister. They are both rock stars, but their lives could not have been more different. Motorhead's lead singer was all about rough, no-nonsense rock, while Guns N' Roses were all about the chaos and excess that defined the late 1980s and early 1990s. But Lemmy's friendship with the band, especially with Axl Rose, wasn't always good. People thought Guns N' Roses would be the next big thing in rock when they first came out in the late 1980s. Their first record, Appetite for Destruction, was a huge hit, and songs like Welcome to the Jungle and Sweet Child of Mine made them famous all over the world. At first, Lemmy noticed how good they were at singing. People liked Guns N' Roses because they had the toughness and energy of old-school rock and roll. Lemmy liked that. Lemmy really liked their early work when he talked about it. He told them they were really good, and Slash's guitar playing made him miss the good old days of rock. That's not right. They want to play and know how to do it, he said. For Lemmy, it wasn't about how they looked, but how good they were, and Guns N' Roses had that. But as time went on, the band's problems began to overshadow their music, which is when Lemmy began to change his mind. Axel Roses Ego was one of Lemmy's main problems with Guns N' Roses. Axel was known for being unpredictable because he often showed up late to shows, got into public fights, and had a bad attitude. This kind of behavior took Lemmy's attention away from what was important: the music. Lemmy had always been about getting on stage, plugging in, and giving it his all every night. Lemmy's dedication to Motorhead never changed, even when they played in front of thousands of people or in a small club. That's why he didn't like how badly Axl behaved. Yes, you're a rock star, but you play music too. Get on stage and do your job, Lemmy told them in his usual direct way. He didn't get why someone with so much ability would let drama and ego get in the way of the music. It became famous that Guns N' Roses live shows were hard to predict. They put on some legendary shows, but there were also events that turned violent because Axl wouldn't play or showed up hours late. Lemmy thought that these acts were a distraction that took away from the power of the band's music. He thought it was wrong that the show was getting in the way of the art. There was a lot of trouble in Guns N' Roses, and that trouble often showed up in public. The band always seemed like it was about to fall apart because of their fights, Axl's drug problems, and his unstable personality. But Lemmy was in charge of Motorhead and kept things running smoothly. He did live the rock and roll life, but he didn't bring it to the stage. Lemmy once said that Motorhead's way of life was like Guns N' Roses' excesses. We didn't waste time with drama. When you go to a Motorhead show, you know what to expect: loud, fast, and real. He thought that Guns N' Roses, even though they were skilled, got lost in their own chaos. This was a shame for Lemmy because he had ability. It was just hidden by his need for attention and pride. This was very clear on Guns N' Roses' famous tour with Metallica in 1991. Because Metallica had to cut their set short because someone got hurt, Guns N' Roses had a chance to save the show. Axl instead showed up late and cut the set short, which made Montreal rage. Lemmy felt sick about what was going on. He didn't think this was rock and roll. He thought it was rude and pointless. Even though Lemmy said bad things about Guns N' Roses, their friendship wasn't all bad. Over the years, he always had some respect for how well they played music, especially Slash. Lemmy and Slash were friends, and Slash often talked about Lemmy in a positive way, calling him a big influence. Even Axl seemed to soften over the years, even though they still fought. The honest way Lemmy acted and his contribution to rock and roll made most of the Guns N' Roses fans admire him. But as time went on, Lemmy and Guns N' Roses began to agree on some things. Members of the band, especially Slash, would sometimes join Lemmy on stage, and they both knew how important the other was to rock history. Lemmy never fully agreed with their crazy behavior, but he admired their ability to make it in the tough rock and roll business. In the end, there was no ignoring that both icons had a huge effect on rock music, even though they did it in very different ways. To do rock and roll right, Lemmy always thought that less drama and more music were the best ways to go. Lemmy's disdain for pop and soft rock, a clash of musical worlds. Lemmy Kilmister was always a reliable source of opinion, particularly on music. Living and drinking the gritty and raw side of rock and roll, Lemmy was the lead singer of Motorhead. His definition of what rock music should be was not loud, rebellious, and unashamedly raw, hence he disliked anything else. Lemmy detested pop and soft rock, hence it is hardly surprising. For him, those musical genres were the reverse of all that rock stood for. Lemmy considered music as a way of life rather than only a pastime. Rock and roll had a soul, a wild spirit untamed in his imagination. On the other hand, that same spirit was cleaned up and made more commercialized on pop and soft rock. They were overly tidy, too safe, and overly preoccupied in ensuring everyone's happiness. Lemmy felt no qualms about sharing his opinions on these kinds of songs in presentations. Many times, he claimed, pop music lacked actual feeling and complexity. He believed that pop music had no actual soul or heart and was created only for profit. Lemmy also felt strongly about soft rock, a genre well known for its languid tunes and simple listening duets. He hated the music, but he also saw it as a mirror of all the issues in the music business. Criticisms of bands like Abba and The Beatles. Lemmy was furious with two rather well-known bands, Abba and The Beatles. Both groups achieved great financial success in the 1970s and 1980s and produced hit songs defining the pop and disco genres. Many believed that the best music ever was Abba's appealing songs and the high-pitched harmonies of the Bee Gees. For Lemmy, however, they were all that went wrong with contemporary music. Lemmy asked Abba during an especially unpleasant interview, "That is not music, that is muzak." His assessment was not on the musician's quality or the band's ability to create a hit. This was so because he felt their music lacked any sort of rebellious edge and was phony. Though they would have been fantastic for the radio, Lemmy felt Abba's neat, cheerful tunes were too good to be taken seriously. The Bee Gees did not fare better in Lemmy's book. The Bee Gees were hardly like Motorhead, known for their falsetto singing and disco tunes like Stayin' Alive. The Bee Gees, Lemmy remarked one time about the Bee Gees' approach, "They sound like they have their nuts in a vice." The Bee Gees, he said, epitomized how shallow pop music was. They wanted to sell songs more than they wanted to be faithful to the rebellious spirit of rock and cared more about style than substance. Lemmy's mockery of pop music in interviews. Lemmy was not content simply not like distant pop music. In conversations, he frequently seized any opportunity to ridicule and criticize it. His criticism was not mild either. It was caustic, merciless, and full of the humor he is known for. Lemmy was once asked what he felt about the 1990s increasing popularity of boy bands. What was he saying? Boy bands? Given that's what they are, toy bands ought to be their calling. Toys for small girls. Lemmy was attacking the entire system that supported and pushed shallow, produced pop music, not only mocking the musicians. Lemmy considered mainstream music as a machine run under the record company producing predictable successes devoid of soul or meaning. Often, he observed, groups of people whose sole objective was to create something that would sell rather than something that was authentic, wrote and produced pop music. Lemmy detested soft rock and pop, not only because they weren't his taste, but also because he felt they were distorting the true essence of rock and roll. Rock, he considered, was about challenging authority, being free, and displaying actual feeling. It was not about profit or mass appeal. He felt that the polished production and appealing melodies of pop music diminished the wild energy that made rock great. Lemmy sensed a larger issue when pop and soft rock emerged. The music business was more focused on profits than on producing music. Real rock and roll was being pushed to the margins in favor of simpler, safer, less exciting music, which made him depressed. Lemmy also disliked soft rock, with its melodic tunes and phrases meant to inspire thought. He considered it made rock and roll dull and monotonous and took the edge off of it. For a man who lived and inhaled the rebellious attitude of rock, this was horrible. Lemmy's criticism of Nirvana and grunge. Lemmy Kilmister didn't hide the fact that he didn't like the grunge movement that took over rock in the early 1990s, especially Nirvana and Kurt Cobain. Lemmy saw grunge as a departure from the wild, unruly spirit that he thought made rock and roll real. Lemmy thought of rock music as a force of defiance and raw power, but Nirvana's songs were about personal things and their music was often sad. Lemmy thought that grunge was too sad and focused on itself. He felt that rock music was truly great when it had wild joy and raw energy. He once said that grunge killed rock by replacing its fun and attitude with themes of sadness and self-pity. Lemmy's old-school view didn't fit with grunge's introspective style. He wanted the rock to be loud, angry, and full of life, not heavy with existential worry. Lemmy's view on punk rock bands. While Lemmy had a lot of respect for the punk movement, he didn't love every punk band that came out of it. Bands that he felt lacked musical talent or focused too much on political messages didn't sit well with him. Lemmy appreciated punk for its raw energy, but he thought some bands took things too far, sacrificing musicianship for ideology. He loved the raw, unpolished sound of early punk bands like The Damned, but criticized punk groups that became too polished or commercialized, viewing them as sellouts. Lemmy believed that punk, despite its rebellious roots, wasn't immune to the same flaws as other genres. In his eyes, the best punk was authentic and full of attitude, not pandering to politics or commercial success. For Lemmy, punk rock needed to stay true to its gritty, raw essence. Anything else, and it lost the very spirit that made it punk in the first place. The irony of Lemmy's hates. It's funny how the music world works sometimes. Here's Lemmy Kilmister, the gritty face of Motorhead, fiercely criticizing bands like Nirvana and Abba. Yet when you dig a little deeper, you find that some of the very bands he detested were, in fact, influenced by his own raw sound. That's rock and roll for you, full of contradictions. Take grunge, for instance. While Lemmy slammed its introspective vibe, the heavy riffs and distorted guitars of bands like Soundgarden were undoubtedly inspired by the hard-hitting energy that Motorhead pioneered. The same goes for some of those pop-punk bands that emerged in the 90s. They borrowed that relentless spirit and driving rhythm from Motorhead, even if Lemmy himself wouldn't give them the time of day. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? The very sound he championed helped shape the genres he found so unpalatable. Despite his biting critiques, many of these bands still held Lemmy in high regard. Nirvana's Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl often cited Motorhead as a significant influence, acknowledging how Lemmy's music pushed them to embrace a more aggressive sound. Even though Lemmy may have dismissed their approach, the respect was mutual. Lemmy's harsh opinions only added to his larger-than-life persona. He was unapologetic, and that honesty resonated with many musicians. They recognized the depth of his artistry and the way he carved out a space for hard rock in an ever-changing music landscape. So, while Lemmy may have hated certain bands, the irony is that his legacy and sound were woven into the very fabric of the genres he critiqued. In the end, it just goes to show that rock and roll is a tangled web of influences, and sometimes the lines between admiration and disdain blur in unexpected ways. Lemmy's disdain for these bands reflects his fierce dedication to rock and roll authenticity. If you enjoyed this deep dive into his controversial opinions, don't forget to like and subscribe for more intriguing insights.